All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on standardizing pulse ingredient definitions. So thanks for joining us today. My name is Janelle Carlin. I'm the Director of Quality and Processing at Pulse Canada. And it's just going to be me this morning walking us through the webinar. So just as a reminder to everyone, I'll be taking some questions at the end of a brief presentation here. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box, which is located on the right-hand side of the screen. And today's session will also be recorded, so we will be able to circulate that with anyone who registered following today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to get started here. So we are going to be talking about pulse ingredient definitions, as well as a newly formed organization known as the International Pulse Ingredient Consortium here today. So before we begin, I just wanted to briefly touch on an overview of pulse ingredient processing and then go through the process that we took in order to actually develop definitions for pulse ingredient and then introduce this organization. You'll see the logo here and a little bit more details to come. So talking about pulse ingredient processing, we have a variety of different pulse types that are available in the marketplace and a variety of different processes as well. So there really is quite a range of ingredients that are available to food industry from pulses. So this is anywhere from whole split pulses all the way to flours and ground fractions, and then actually fractionated ingredients, which are isolating specific seed components. And then additional forms of processing, which can be used to kind of create more customized ingredients. So taking some time here to walk through some of those more basic steps. Typically, we start with cleaning, sorting, and dehulling as a baseline for almost all processes to produce pulse ingredients here. So you'll see this image here, starting with the whole seed on the left-hand side, split seeds to hull. So this dehulling process typically uses abrasive forces, and that disrupts the bond between that seed coat and the inner portion of the seed, which is known as the cotyledon, and physically splits the two. So that on that right-hand side, that hull portion is very rich in dietary fiber. And then you get the remaining seed components from that split seed there. So there are differences that we might get in terms of the quality here for ingredients like whole, splits, and hulls. So differences between pulse types. So here we have navy beans and yellow peas on the slide. You can see they're very different shape. They have a little bit different adhesion in terms of how well or how tightly bound that hull sticks to the seed coat. So we might get differences in the separation efficiency during that dehulling process, but also within a pulse type. So differences in seed size, for example, for something like yellow pea, a bigger seed versus a smaller seed, moisture content, things like that can also affect the process here for dehulling. So once you have dehulled a product, or starting with the whole seed as well, we can also go through a series of milling and grinding stages to reduce the particle size of an ingredient and produce things like grits, which are a little bit coarser, flours of varying degrees of coarseness. So here you can see on this slide, we're starting from that whole seed or dehulled, taking the hulls, grinding them down, and you can get varying degrees of fineness for flours. One thing to note here is there's a bunch of different technologies that are available to pulse flour millers to produce an array of ingredients. So on the top right-hand side of the slide here, there's just two illustrations of milling diagrams. You can see here that there's various points that you can control the process. So adjusting something like the rotations per minute, looking at different sieve sizes to really control that particle size. So the mill itself, as well as the conditions that are applied, will all ultimately have an effect on the resulting quality of that flour. Particularly the particle size is something that's really important in terms of determining functionality, but it's also really important when we go to talk about fractionation to get a really good separation efficiency of things like proteins from starches if you're looking to extract those components there. Getting into protein fractionation. So once you've dehulled the seed, then you've ground it down, then we can go and actually separate those individual seed components. So this picture here on the right-hand side, you can actually kind of see what those components look like, where we have the starch granules, which are nice and large, and the protein bodies, which are really small. And then we have cell wall components as well. which contain different types of fibers and non-starch polysaccharides. And what we can do is do a series of different steps in order to actually fractionate and separate those components from one another. So air classification is a common one, which uses, it's a dry method of fractionation and separates the particles based on their size and density differences. So you can see just that starch is physically much bigger than the protein, so you can separate that way. We're using something called alkaline extraction and isoelectric precipitation, which uses the solubility of these individual components in various alkaline and acidic pH conditions in order to selectively precipitate and solubilize the material. So you can get, by this method, much higher purity levels than using that dry method of fractionation. We do have some other emerging techniques, maybe a little bit more common in the literature, but we do start to see some of these products potentially coming into the market. So things including membrane filtration, salt extraction, and triboelectric separation as well are also being studied. Another thing I wanted to note is that outside of all of these kind of common processing steps there are a number of additional pre-treatments or post-treatments that might be applied to that whole seed or the finished product to really alter either physical chemical traits, functional traits, sensory or nutritional properties of ingredients. So there are some examples listed here on this slide, but that really opens the door in terms of introducing an array of different types of products. So not only do we have proteins, we have high moisture extruded proteins, we have low moisture extruded proteins, we can have roasted flours, we can have dry steam treated flours. So there really is a lot more options if you start to think about incorporating things like these additional processed ingredients. So here you can kind of get a sense of that just in a diagram form. So taking a look at kind of all of those different processing steps that we talked about here today, starting with different starting material is going to affect the ingredient, which processing methods you apply, as well as if there's optional pre or post treatments applied. There really are a variety of pulse ingredient offerings available in the marketplace. One thing I did want to note as well is there's a lot of different things. We kind of talked about some of them already, but that can cause some variability in terms of how these ingredients might be used, which does allow for a lot of versatility in creating really specific ingredients for particular end use, but it also can make it a little bit maybe difficult to navigate by the industry just in terms of identifying and maybe talking about these ingredients. So this slide here just lists some examples. So pulse types are obviously quite different from another, being completely different crops. But even within a pulse type, looking at the individual variety, genetic influences, how each of these varieties might individually react to different growing environments, different agronomic practices, how that seed is then characterized, the physical composition, the chemical composition, how it was stored, and then that processing history is quite significant. So we have kind of those very broad categories of processing, but those settings that are applied and the same process from a supplier to supplier can vary quite distinctly and really produce quite different ingredients. And that has a significant effect on the resulting ingredient quality. So that's things like the physical chemical properties. We talked about particle size, but also just the protein content, the digestibility, the level of denaturation of proteins, for example. And that all ultimately affects how you might use that within a formulation. So here is just to kind of highlight what is kind of going on in the industry where pea protein ingredients, so this is something that's produced either by that air classification method or through wet extraction. There's a lot of variability in terms of what's available in the marketplace. So on the left-hand side here, these are specs from publicly available sources of commercial ingredients, so publicly available information, just pulling from websites from manufacturers where you can see the differences and the range just in terms of the protein content alone. So that is just looking at a single parameter. There's really quite a range in protein content, and there's a big range in terms of what companies are calling these ingredients as well. So here we have yellow field pea, 44%, texturized pea protein concentrate, pea protein isolate, just pea protein. And that can make the sector a little bit difficult to navigate with everyone using a little bit of terminology to talk about things that may or may not be processed similarly or may not perform the same in various applications. So that's kind of what we're trying to address here today by coming up with definitions and a common way just to talk about these ingredients so that everybody can kind of be on the same page. So moving along, developing these actual definitions. So developing that common language to help to navigate this pulse ingredient sector. So the reason why this kind of organization was formed was actually the result of a meeting that was held in the spring of 2020 upon the formation of a group known as the Pulse Processing Advisory Committee. So this group was a committee that was formed of 20 industry representatives, and this included equipment manufacturers, millers, food processors, grower associations, and government-sponsored organizations that came together as part of a workshop in order to identify areas of work in the pre-competitive space that would ultimately help to lead to increased consumption of pulses as well as pulse-derived products. So as part of this workshop, 9 areas of work were identified that would help to really grow the sector. However, the members of this committee were then asked to prioritize specific areas of work that would have the most benefit. So the 2 that emerged as equally important priorities, but higher in terms of this list of 9 areas, were human health and nutrition and standards. And that's kind of what was the foundation of what is now the International Pulse Ingredient Consortium. So looking at developing standards for the industry, specifically, the committee identified that they would like to develop a common language for terms used to describe various aspects of pulses. So here, the group asked if we could look at some things like starches, pulse proteins, pulse flours, meals, and grits specifically to really help to promote that common language and use in the industry, and that when we're looking at kind of developing that language to look at specific factors like the particle size, like the protein content, like the particle distribution in the development of this common language for these ingredients. So with that, then, after kind of this vision was created by this Pulse Processing Advisory Committee, there was a long period of time where Pulse Canada went about collecting a lot of different information to use as background to actually help to draft these definitions. So I'll talk a little bit about that process here. So during that data collection and review, there were a number of considerations that were looked at to use as that background information. So we commissioned 2 reports by Intertech to specifically look at recommendations and whether or not common definitions could be established for specifically pulse flours and pulse proteins. So as part of this Intertech report, in addition to some extra digging and data collection on our end, we looked at existing compositional standards for related products. So using things like Codex Alimentarius, Canada's Food and Drugs Regulation, United States Code for Federal Regulations, and then also looking at existing definitions for pulse ingredients in the feed and pet food sectors. So here there are existing definitions for pulse ingredients, but they are not intended for that food industry utilization. So that's the AFCO as well as CFIA definitions there. In the case where there maybe wasn't a lot of information in some of these areas, we also look to publicly available sources. So what's available in terms of looking at manufacturers' web pages and their specs for individual commercial ingredients, as well as published literature. So I'm just going to take some time to walk through some of that background information. So starting with flours, meals, and grits as a category. So looking at some of the standards that are put in place for comparable products. So here's just an example from the Codex Alimentarius, looking at wheat flour. Specifically, I just wanted to point out here that in this definition, we're talking about what crop the ingredient is derived from, the kind of process that is applied, and what seed components are specifically included in this type of ingredient. Taking a look then at the specifications for these ingredients, here is just two examples. So one looking at wheat flour, one looking at cassava flour. And you can see there's various levels of detail here from ingredient to ingredient, just in terms of what the specifications are for that particular product. So on the wheat flour side, there's a lot more compositional requirements. So there is minimum moisture contents, fat contents, minimum protein contents. And here we also have a particle size requirement. On the cassava flour side, we have moisture content, starch, and ash that are specified. And it even goes as far as to indicate fine versus coarse degree of granularity with that particle size. And taking a look specifically when we're looking at all of these ground ingredients, the particle size requirement is something that's really important across the board. So this is something that you can see here. So this is a lot of existing definitions that are defined under FDA and Codex as well, where particle size is something that pops up for almost every definition in this case. And you can see that there's differences in terms of whether it's a whole wheat flour or refined wheat flour as an example. For corn, we have differences looking across grits, meals, and flours. Cassava, again, that was a unique example where we have fine and coarse defined in the standards of identity for that particular ingredient. But just wanted to emphasize here that particle size is a really important parameter for these types of products. So looking at then some of the existing definitions for pulse ingredients, specifically in the feed and pet food sectors. So here's that AFCO definition for pulse flours, where they're specifying specifically the process by mechanically milling a dehulled seed specifically. And we do have compositional requirements, so looking at not less than 20% protein and not more than 3% crude fiber. CFIA has a pea mill definition where it's looking at grinding the whole seed down and just indicates that you need to specify the composition while there is not any actual standards or requirements for composition. So looking at protein ingredients now, some of those comparable ingredients. So here we see wheat protein products. And this one I think is an interesting example just because it specifies differences in some of these protein ingredients based on their functionality specifically. So here we have vital wheat gluten, which is characterized by high viscoelasticity when hydrated. Devitalized wheat gluten is characterized by the reduced viscoelasticity because it's denatured. So here is just an interesting example of using functionality to describe an ingredient. Here then taking a look at soy protein products. In this case here, we're distinguishing differences in soy protein products based on their protein composition and indicating kind of that method of analysis there. So using that nitrogen conversion factor of 6.25 to ultimately lead to that standard here. So we have soy protein flour, which has to be between 50 and 65% protein. Protein concentrate, 65 to 90. And then in the case of 90% or more is when you have a soy protein isolate. So here I just wanted to point out the standard and the compositional requirements for wheat protein content specifically. I just thought this one was interesting in particular because here you can see that the methods of analysis are specifically highlighted when you're looking at some of these requirements for this particular ingredient. So looking at now some of those existing feed and pet food definitions on the protein side. So here we have the AFCO definition for a pulse protein. So starting with that mechanically separated dehulled ingredient, then it's air classified. So here again, that process is described in the definition. And then we do have compositional requirements where it can't contain less than 53% crude protein on a dry matter basis. So looking at CFIA, this is a similar one where we're looking at air classification specifically to produce this pea protein ingredient, except here there's a little bit lower requirement for protein at about 40%. Looking at faba bean, there's a similar one under CFIA for faba bean air classified ingredients. Faba beans have a little bit naturally higher protein content. So you can see here that minimum protein level is a little bit higher for this faba bean specific definition than the comparable one for pea. CFIA is another one here, so pea protein, but this one is talking about that wet extracted protein ingredient where it specifies that you're removing the majority of the non-protein constituents from that dried, clean, and dehulled seed, which is wet milled, acid extracted, and isoelectric precipitation before being spray dried. So here, again, we see that that method of processing is specified, but not necessarily any compositional standards are applied. So moving on to starch ingredients here, here we looked at the AFCO definition for pulse starch, which is the fraction that remains after removing protein and fiber from the pulse seeds. And here it's specifying specifically that air classified material where there is a 65% minimum of starch on a dry matter basis. Looking at the CFIA example, here we have one for fava bean. Again, it's that dry milled and air classified ingredient with a 55% starch minimum. And then pea as well, where again, that dry milled air classified product and a minimum of 65% starch. Now moving on to fiber, CFIA here in particular has one definition talking about a fibrous material. So it's called pea pulp, or it's the fibrous product that's obtained after removing the majority of the starch and protein constituents using a wet milling process. And then there's approvals for this ingredient to be used in specific feed applications. Fiber is an interesting one. This is one of the few where there are some regulatory definitions in the food space specifically, where pea cotyledon fiber and pea hull fiber are approved under Health Canada and their list of accepted and reviewed dietary fibers, where pea cotyledon fiber is described as being derived from a dehulled peas, processed for starch or protein specifically, and obtained through conventional procedures, but indicating that there is no chemical modification. And pea hull fiber is that outer seed coat specifically of the peas obtained by mechanical separation or conventional processes. We also have kind of similar descriptions in the FDA. However, here their dietary fibers are categorized as either being intrinsic and intact, naturally occurring. So this is where pea hull fiber currently falls under. And there's another area of dietary fibers that are described under the FDA as isolated or synthetic non-digestible carbohydrates that do meet that definition to be a dietary fiber. And pea cotyledon fiber is able to be classified as a mixed plant cell wall fiber under this particular definition. So with that, this is kind of just a reminder of all of the kind of background material that was collected here. So looking at commercially available pulse ingredients, looking at existing pulse definitions specifically in the pet food and animal sectors, and looking at comparable ingredient definitions in the food sectors. A lot of cases, if there wasn't a lot of information, we also looked to academic and public literature. And a really intensive process and consulting with industry stakeholders. So you can see here a list of companies that were involved in that post-processing advisory committee as part of this consultation process. So with all of this background information that was collected then, that's when that industry engagement really began. So we went through a series of drafts of definitions and then brought it back to that pulse processing advisory committee, did online surveys, a couple virtual workshops, as well as one-on-one stakeholder meetings to really refine and come down to those finalized set of definitions. So with that, I'm going to now walk through the actual definitions that have been proposed. So starting with pulse flours. So here we have three specific kinds of flours that are encompassed under this pulse flour definition. And they are defined as the product that is derived from mechanical grinding or milling action of a whole or anatomical component of a pulse seed, in which no less than 90% of the material passes through an 8.41 millimeter sieve, or you can confirm that using a validated method of analysis. And here specifically, and this is going to be the case across all of the definitions, this ingredient is derived from a single pulse market class. And what a pulse market class means is that's just distinguishing the exact class there. So if we're talking about field peas, it's specifying whether it's a green pea or a yellow pea. So here there's some additional language around fortification allowances, but ultimately there are 3 major categories of pulse flour that each have additional criteria that are applied. So looking at whole pulse flour, this is defined as the pulse flour that contains all of the components of the whole seed. So here we have the seed coat, cotyledon, and so that can be either ground down whole, or you're milling a dehulled seed and introducing that ground seed coat back into that ground cotyledon flour at a rate that really reflects the composition of the original starting material, constitutes approximately 95% or more of that original starting material. So here we specify that whole pulse flour does not include anything that has specifically been processed to isolate or remove any components of the seed, or flours that have been reconstituted beyond naturally occurring levels that would be reflective of that original starting material. So looking at dehulled pulse flours, these are defined as pulse flours that had the seed coat removed. And then it does not include anything specifically processed to isolate, again, components or things that have been reconstituted beyond those naturally occurring levels. So just that flour derived from the inner cotyledon portion of the seed. Now looking at starch-rich pulse flour, so this is the pulse flour that has been specifically processed to remove non-starch components. So here thinking of that starch-rich component derived from air classification, but it still contains significant concentrations of things like proteins and fibers. You can't effectively remove all of that, where starch represents less than 85% of the flour calculated on a dry weight basis. So looking at all of these definitions of pulse flours, there is another designation that applies to these particular pulse ingredient definitions, and that is specialty milled. So all specialty milled pulse flours indicates is that some additional form of processing has been applied either to the whole seed or to the flour after milling, and all IPIC does here is just say that this needs to be clearly stated in the name of transparency. So there is a couple of different examples here. So in that definition itself, we see a roasted whole pea flour, deflavored and dehulled lentil flour. Here I have a specific example that if a starch-rich pulse flour were to have that specialty milled designation, how it might be actually talked about and called would be a pre-gelatinized starch-rich yellow pea flour. So here it's just that you have to indicate and specify whether or not that additional processing has been applied. Looking at pulse meals now, so here it's defined as mechanical grinding of a single pulse market class where there are specific particle size requirements of no less than 90% of material can pass through a 1.68 millimeter sieve and no more than 45% can pass through 0.297. Looking at pulse grits, these are defined as the product of mechanical grinding and milling, a little bit coarser particle size requirements now. So no less than 95% through 2 millimeter and no more than 20% through a 0.84 millimeter sieve. So here looking at pulse protein, so here is defined as the protein that is extracted from a pulse seed. And there are 2 major categories of protein that you can see here. So concentrates and isolates, where concentrates are defined as the protein extracted from the pulse seed of a single market class, where the final product is greater than 48% protein, but less than 80% protein. And here I just wanted to indicate here, we have 48% protein highlighted in red, just because in some additional conversations with industry for some particular pulse protein concentrates derived from chickpea as an example, you might not actually be able to meet that 48% protein requirement. And these definitions are really meant to be reflective of what is commercially available in the marketplace. So at this point, we're asking, so if anyone who's listening to this webinar here today, if you do have some data on chickpea protein concentrate ingredients that are lower than that 48%, we're just looking for some feedback in terms of what that minimum requirement might be. And I just wanted to flag this. So this is one of the benefits here of the way that these definitions are being proposed, that they're flexible and they're allowed to be modified as the industry kind of grows, and we do see differences in processing and not rooted in regulation. So that's something that's kind of interesting about this approach for pulse ingredient definitions. So moving on here, pulse protein isolates. So this is defined as the protein extracted from a single market class of pulses with a greater than 80% protein content. Similar to the flowers, here we have a specification of additionally processed pulse protein, where this is just an additional designation where you just have to clearly state whether there's been additional processing applied pre or post extraction. So as an example here, a pulse protein isolate, we might have a hydrolyzed yellow pea protein isolate. Looking at pulse starches here, so there's only one definition for pulse starches, and this is defined as the starch that's been specifically extracted from the pulse seed and representing greater than 85% of the final product calculated on a dry weight basis. Similar to the protein ingredients here, we have that designation of additionally processed, where you have to indicate whether it's been treated there. So here in the starch industry, there's lots of different modifications that have been evaluated. So things like hydrothermal treatments, cross-linking, catenization, oxidization is a list here on this slide that you can see. Finally here, we have pulse fibers, where there are two types of pulse fibers defined. That broader category of pulse fibers, though, are defined as the fiber extracted from the pulse seed of a single market class, corresponding to a definition of a dietary fiber in the jurisdiction to which that fiber will be sold. So before we saw the pea cotyledon and that pea hull fiber were defined under the FDA and Health Canada definitions for dietary pulse fibers, where pulse hull fiber specifically is defined as the fiber that's derived from mechanical grinding action of seed coats that have been separated from the cotyledon and germ portions of the seed, specifically that aqueous solvents have not been used to produce this ingredient, where dietary fiber has to be greater than 75% on a dry weight basis. And then the inner fiber definition is looking at pulse fibers that have been extracted from the seed cotyledon itself using aqueous solvents with less than 85% starch on a dry weight basis. So with that, there's a total of 10 definitions that are captured here, and they are going to be housed and lived in this organization known as the International Pulse Ingredient Consortium. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that here. Where the International Pulse Ingredient Consortium, also called IPIC, is its own non-for-profit organization, and the mission of this organization is really to support the pulse ingredient sector by aligning pulse ingredients and certifying pulse ingredients according to these industry-aligned definitions. So I kind of mentioned this before, but these definitions are supposed to be representative of what's available in the marketplace commercially, and broad enough that companies can really distinguish themselves from one another within these categories, ultimately to really align with how we talk about these ingredients and enhance transparency and trust to really ensure quality products in that B2B market space specifically. So I'll mention it again, these major categories reflect commonalities and provide an opportunity for within these categories that are quite broad to still allow companies to distinguish themselves from one another and have that flexibility in labeling and nomenclature because they're being housed under this organization. They're not rooted in law. So they do have that flexibility to be changed, like we saw looking for some feedback there on that pulse protein concentrate definition specifically. So anyone can become a member of IPIC. So one thing that we are asking is that people that organizations that would like to show support for this common language initiative could sign up and become members of IPIC just to indicate support for that common language around ingredients. It's $1,000 Canadian annual fee. However, anyone who is a member of IPIC is then eligible to apply for certification of their ingredients. So once you've joined and once you're in good standing, there's no additional charge. You can register as little or as many ingredients as you would like. But once your ingredient has been approved, then that allows members to have access to the certification mark, which can be used in B2B communications. And what that does is it provides assurances to industry that this particular ingredient meets that industry-aligned definition that everybody knows what it is, common language, really enhancing that trust in the sector. So this certification for those approved ingredients can be used on COAs, for example, on company websites. Another thing that we kind of wanted to highlight is particularly in the academic space, that by referencing these definitions, this is a really good way, again, to kind of promote that common language. So we recently just published this review on the use of lentil ingredients in the meat products. But I just wanted to highlight that as part of this, we did refer back to the IPIC definitions in terms of how these ingredients were discussed in the review. And this is something that I think could be a little bit more widely adopted by the academic sector, and something that we're asking just to point to this to really start to kind of talk about these ingredients in that common way, both in published literature as well as in B2B communications. So that process to register ingredients, once you're a member, there is individual forms and questions that apply to each category of ingredients differently. So there is a membership guide that is accessible on the Pulse, the IPIC website, which is pulseingredients.com. And this membership guide is a really good reference. It has all of the definitions in the guide. It also has and indicates all of the questions that are asked. If you want to register every individual ingredient, in addition to what requirements are needed to upload when you're looking at uploading a certificate of analysis, just to verify that an ingredient does in fact align with the IPIC definition. So once you'll have to fill out an individual form for every single ingredient, and then what we'll do is we'll approve that on the back end. And once approved, the ingredient will be added to the ingredient directory on the website here. So on the IPIC website, again, that's pulseingredients.com, there is a member directory as well as an ingredient directory. So the member directory includes companies. So for example, Pulse Canada has signed up and is a member in support of this initiative, but we don't have any ingredients that we produce or sell. But our organization would pop up under this member directory. And what this does is it displays the company name, logo, address, website, and any sales contact information that you would like to have displayed. And there is an option for a search function by company name. However, not all members might have ingredients. And so any ingredient that is then approved will pop up in that ingredient directory. So understanding that companies might have multiple ingredient offerings, there is an individual list for every single ingredient that has been approved, and that ingredient will specifically display what company offers that ingredient. It'll include the name, logo, website, as well as sales contact information for anyone interested in purchasing that particular ingredient. It'll indicate the company's brand name, so what the company calls that ingredient. So here I have an example of pea protein PP67, where you don't necessarily know if that's a pea protein isolate, a concentrate, if it's been additionally processed. So alongside that brand name, it'll also indicate that IPIC name, where here I have, that's actually a yellow pea protein concentrate. So in that ingredient directory, there is an option to search by either company, by the ingredient type. So if you want to look at whole pulse flours, if you want to look at pulse starches, or the option to search by pulse market class. So if you're interested in a flour from red lentil, you can search for that. So with that here, there's a little video that kind of is just walking through what that looks like. So here is just looking at that ingredient search page. So here are just a number of ingredients that are currently registered. So you can see that brand name as well as the IPIC name, and then that member directory. So you can see a list of all of the members that have currently signed up under IPIC. So with that, I can take some questions. So that's all I have in terms of the presentation. I would direct you to the website here. All of the information I presented is available on that website, including that, that member PDF package there where you can really download, look at all of the definitions, look at the process in terms of what it means to be a member, to register ingredients. That's all available on the website there. All right. So we can probably share the slides. I don't see any problem with that, but we will circulate the recording after as well. So that will be available to everyone who registered here. So IPIC, is it a globally recognized organization? It's intended to be international in scope. So it is incorporated and registered, I believe in Manitoba specifically. But we have applied for that certification. Currently, it's just in North America, but I think the intention is that we'll broaden it as we get more members and a little bit more fees accessible to broaden that certification beyond to areas like Europe, Australia, China, for example. There's another question here. All of the companies that were showed. So anyone that was showed kind of in that video are ones that are currently members of IPIC and have ingredients registered. So you can actually go to that pulseingredients.com and you can see a list of current companies that have signed up, have been members, and the ingredient directory will give you a list of all of the specific ingredients that have been registered by those companies. Here we have another question, is what's the legal force of these definitions? Where here it's it's not rooted in law. That's kind of the design by nature, is it was intended to be flexible. However, the certification process, companies have to provide a certificate of analysis to indicate where we can give them that approval to use the certification mark. We will say that it does in fact align with those definitions, and we'll always reserve the right to request a third-party certificate of analysis to verify that it does in fact meet the requirements. And if it does not, then we can remove their right to use that certification mark. But the intention here is that these definitions are not rooted in law. They're flexible in nature, and that's why they're being housed under this organization. All right, so here we have another question looking at coming across the term pulse starch isolate and many published research articles reporting a starch content of 90% or higher. What is the market importance of such starch isolates in Canada? So there are a number of companies in Canada that offer that ingredient. Here, I think that 80% requirement for starch isolate, there are sometimes the process isn't optimized necessarily to extract a really pure starch. So that's where that minimum of 80% requirement was put in place under this category specifically. Here we have, is there a fee to be a registered company? So it is $1,000 Canadian fee to sign up to become a member of IPIC. However, once you're registered as a member, then you can register as many ingredients as you like, and it is a reoccurring fee on an annual basis. So that $1,000 fee will reoccur according to the calendar year. There's another question asking if there's any efforts to build out these definitions, getting as granular as application. I think the one thing that's interesting with the way this was designed is that's definitely a potential to get there. I think just in establishing this initiative, really the definitions were created kind of as broad as they could be to really be reflective of what's available in the marketplace. I think ultimately that's a really great kind of vision for the future. What we are hoping as well is that moving forward, right now there's an interim board in place, but moving forward, we're looking to get nominations from industry stakeholders to actually be representatives of the board and lead developments and further refine these definitions, and getting as granular as application or end use of some of these ingredients, that's definitely a route that could be taken by the industry. But here we really want to make sure that this is industry aligned, industry led, that these definitions are broad enough that there still is that ability to have kind of a competitive advantage within each of these categories. So another question here, all of the specifications on composition, so things like protein and starch, those are all available on the website. So the definitions are public, and you can find those on the website there. One question here I see as well is that as a CPG company, not a lot of customers really understand the word pulses. One thing I think to note here is that this platform is really intended to be used for B2B communication. So it's a tool to help ingredient suppliers communicate in a transparent manner with food industry. And again, that not being rooted in standards, it doesn't affect labeling requirements. So even though we're using the term pulse, it's really meant to be for ingredient suppliers communicating to food industry and still allowing food industry to communicate on that individual crop type. So that's where you see it's a pulse flour category as an example, but all of the ingredients listed, it'll specify red lentil. And it may be I'm not necessarily an expert there on the consumer side, but it might be a little bit easier to get more equity with that individual crop type than the word pulse broadly, but we do recognize that it doesn't necessarily have as much consumer equity as some other crops. So another question asking about these definitions in relation to regulatory bodies. So these are not recognized by regulatory bodies. So this entire platform is not intended to be rooted in law. However, we did look at those definitions that are in regulation under those bodies just to make sure that there was some alignment. And this specifically, this pulseingredients.com is really intended to be for the food industry for the time being. That was kind of the initial focus because there already are existing definitions in the food and feed space. Didn't want to create any confusion there. So these definitions are really intended to support B2B communications in that food industry. All right, I'm going to wait one more minute here to see if we have any further questions. So you can also reach out to me personally if you have questions. It's jcarlin@pulsecanada.com. And there's a question here. Can an Indian company be a member of IPIC? Absolutely. It is intended to be international. So if you would like, you can definitely sign up. All right. I don't see any other questions coming in. So thank you everyone for joining here. If you have questions, again, jcarlin@pulsecanada.com. You can get all of the information that I talked about here today is available on the website for IPIC, pulseingredients.com. And we will circulate this recording as well after if you'd like to share to any of your colleagues. But thank you for joining here today and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks.